There probably isn't a person out there that has talked about holy damage as much, nor for as long as I have. It has been a very popular topic on this channel, and we're going to talk about it one last time before the DLC. Now, the reason I'm going to talk about it is because I've been getting a lot of questions asking if holy damage is finally going to be viable in the DLC. Is it going to be good? I'm scared to use it. And like all of these questions are just like mind-boggling to me. I didn't know how strong the stigma was against holy damage. It might be partially my fault, but people are literally just avoiding holy damage at all costs in the DLC and in the base game. And I'm just here to tell you that don't worry about it, just use holy damage, take it into the DLC, and honestly, use it in the base game if you want to. If there's a particular holy base weapon that looks really cool and you want to use it, just go ahead and use it. It's going to be perfectly fine. Now, don't get me wrong, holy damage is still the worst damage type in the game, and honestly, quite literally, the most useless damage type From Software has ever made. There's like so many resist enemies, and there's like hardly anything weaker to it. But even then, I still wouldn't be afraid to use it. Now, to start off with, is holy damage going to be good in the DLC? I don't know, maybe it is. From the little time that I actually had to play with it, I didn't notice a lot of enemies being resist to holy damage. There's plenty of speculation out there being that it's like the land of shadows. There's probably a lot of dark and blasphemous things going on, of which a lot of enemies might be weaker to holy damage. People might also point towards Godwin being in the DLC, and obviously Deathblight exists, but the funny thing is, I don't know why the assumption is that Deathblight is going to be like countered by holy damage, when it's actually in fact the opposite. All the Deathblight enemies in the base game are actually resist to holy damage. Fortisacks, Worm Faces, Revenants, all of these enemies are actually resist to holy damage, which is weird. I don't really know why that is. Like, you can kill Revenants really quickly with healing spells, but if you're using holy damage, then they resist. Don't understand that. Even if that's not the case, I wouldn't be scared to take holy damage into the DLC, because at the very worst, it's going to be like the base game. A lot of people specifically talk about holy damage being bad at the end of the game, which is true, but holy damage is literally the worst damage type from start to finish. Like almost every single boss, Margit, Godric, Radahn, Godfrey, Morgott, even like random mini-bosses like the Erdtree avatars, Tree Sentinels, Godskin, the Omens, and the list goes on. There are so many enemies that are just most resist to holy damage. Now, the reason I say it's still not going to be that big of an issue is because their resistances are still only at 40%, which typically most enemies have about a 20% resist to a particular element, which is going to be a significant difference, but people don't really notice it anyway. Like, all the gameplay that you're seeing right now is me using a pure holy damaging weapon against enemies that are 40% resist to holy. I bet a lot of you guys didn't even know that Millennia, Radahn, Godskin Duo are most resist to holy damage. They all have 40% resist, but as you can see here with these holy damaging weapons, it doesn't really look like it, and it feels the exact same as all the other damage types. Now, if these holy damaging weapons were just doing another damage type, they would just be better. If something like the Envoy's Longhorn was doing magic or lightning damage instead, it would just be a better weapon, because it just means more damage against most bosses. But yeah, all of this gameplay is against 40% holy resist enemies, and they're all getting destroyed. Now, the actual problem starts to come in with 80% resist bosses, because that's when you definitely start to notice that enemies have a lot of resist. And there are 3 bosses that actually are 80% holy resist, and that is Fortisacks, Malekith, and Radagon Elden Beast. Now, Fortisacks and Malekith don't have much health, so you probably might not notice that much with your holy damage, but you definitely will notice against Radagon and Elden Beast. I've done plenty of holy damage only runs, and every single Radabeast fight lasts like 20 minutes. But the thing is, when you have a holy damaging build, you're more likely than not have a faith build of which you have access to so many other damage types. You can just use things like Catch Flame or Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, and you can just destroy all of these bosses. I probably wouldn't use the lightning damage against Fortisacks because he's also 80% resist, but just using fire-based spells or even pest threads, it's going to make quick work of a lot of these bosses. So the fact that you have that versatility with a faith type of build kind of just adds to the reason why holy damage isn't really that bad. And there are a lot of other 80% resist bosses as well. It's not just holy damage. Renala is 80% resist to magic damage. There are actually just as many 80% fire resist enemies than holy resist enemies. Moog is 80%. Rykard is, although that one doesn't really count because you can just use a Serpent Hunter. And even the Magma Worms are 80% resist. But nobody really talks about fire damage being that bad because, one, these bosses are optional compared to the mandatory bosses that you actually have to fight with Malekith and Radabeast. And there are lots more enemies and bosses that are weaker to fire damage compared to holy damage. So yes, if there is a particular holy build or holy type of weapon that looks really cool and is very aesthetically pleasing to you and you want to use it, just go ahead and use it. Now, if you did want to make an optimal build, or if you actually were using an infused type of weapon, then holy damage is probably not going to be your answer, especially with those weapons that can be infused. I'd go with a flame arts infusion over a sacred infusion like 99% of the time. But now we're going to get into why holy damage is the most useless damage type. Yes, we've established that it's not that big of a deal, but for me personally, it does make me very upset, as I'll talk about later. But to first state some of these bosses' resistances. On screen right now is a chart that I made going over all the remembrance bosses and their resistances. And as you can see, a lot of them are very resist to holy damage, if not all of them. And if they're not most resist to holy damage, then their second highest resist is probably holy damage. There's probably a specific lore reason for this. Maybe due to like a lot of these bosses having like shards of the Elden Ring. And maybe like that's classified as some very holy stuff and they have to be holy resist. Don't know. The only boss that is actually weak to holy damage on this list is going to be the Regal Ancestor Spirit at -20 holy resist. And obviously that's going to perform really well. But the thing is, it's not even uniquely weak to holy damage. Fire damage also gets the exact same resist. But to go outside of the remembrance bosses, this is actually a list of all the enemies that are also resist to holy damage, which that is a lot more than all of the other damage types. And if you look at this list, a lot of these enemies are a bunch of mini bosses. They're not even just like random trash mobs. But the most egregious one, as I mentioned before, is somehow these like Deathblight enemies are resist to holy damage. Don't know why we can like counter things like Revenants with healing spells, but they have to be resist to holy damage. But to go ahead and look at the enemies that are actually weak to holy damage is basically just the undead enemies. All like the skeletons, the deathbirds, all of these ones are going to be weak to holy damage. But the funny thing is, all of these bosses are just as weak to holy damage as they are to striking damage. So it's not even uniquely weak to holy damage. And there's like thousands of buffs out there that can actually boost your damage against undead enemies. You don't even need a faith type of build to benefit. You could just use things like Sacred Order, Shared Order. You just use these buffs and you use any other damage type because it will just boost your damage to undead enemies by like over 100%. And you could just use like your fire type weapon, your lightning weapon, magic weapon, doesn't matter what it is. You're just going to be doing like twice as much damage to these enemies. Especially against these deathbirds, you could just use something like a holy pot. You don't even need a faith build. Just craft a couple of holy pots, get a couple of buffs like Sacred Order and Shared Order, maybe throw in like the holy tier and the faith tier, and you're probably like 1 or 2 shotting these deathbirds. And it doesn't require any faith. So like the only enemies of which holy damage might be useful, there's like thousands of buffs in the game that can just help counter these enemies. So if you wanted to make an optimal build to utilize a damage type that is going to like counteract a lot of enemies, there is literally no reason to use holy damage. Because the only things that are uniquely weak to holy damage are the Cemetery Shade and the Albinurix. Like that is it. This thing is beyond useless. But getting into why holy damage makes me mad, it is partly because that holy is like my favorite aesthetic and it is the worst damage type. It also gets the worst spell and Ash of War options compared to all the other elements. Don't know why we didn't get Morgoth's or Radagon's incantations. Hopefully they're in the DLC. But it's mainly because of how much of an issue damage types are in general with this game. I don't know what they were thinking with the damage type situation in this game, but compared to all the other games, this is a complete mess. To start off with, you got rid of dark damage from Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 and replaced it with holy damage, which, one, not that big of a deal. I'm actually excited for holy damage to finally be in the series. But the thing is, with dark damage, it was an intelligence and faith based of damage type. So all those dark types of weapons or spells were just int faith. So you actually had a good synergy with a particular type of build. But then in this game, holy damage is primarily faith, but there are like some int faith spells, but that's specifically for like the Golden Order based stuff. But some of the Golden Order weapons don't get an int faith scaling. So it kind of has this weird half in between for int faith and faith. And they also just removed fire damage being intelligence faith as well. And now that's just purely faith. And then you have this weird situation with lightning damage that's like half dexterity and half faith. And if they just went all into faith, then I guess that means that faith just has too many damaging options. And this is going to leave like intelligence builds with just like magic damage, which I guess that's my speculation as to why we haven't gotten like lightning faith based weapons or a lightning faith based infusion. And it's probably because that holy damage came in and just fucked up everything. We had a good thing going. Like magic was for intelligence, lightning was for faith, and then fire and dark was for faith and intelligence. And it had so much amazing synergy with all these different types of builds that we just don't have any longer. Don't know what they have against faith intelligence, but clearly they had no plans to build on it in this game. But yeah, I've been shitting on holy damage since day one, and it's because of all of those reasons. It replaced an amazing damage type like Dark, and it has ended up being the worst one and ruined all types of cool synergy that we had with faith and intelligence. Anyway, that is the end of that discussion. Hopefully that's the last time I have to talk about holy damage. It's probably not going to be the last time. But yes, please involve yourself in the discussion down in the comments below. Just let me know what your opinions are. And as always, please do like and subscribe as well. And yeah, catch you guys around. Bye.